He spit on a soldier. Right there, outside Buckingham Palace, an American tourist crossed a line no one should ever cross. But what happened next wasn't a punch. It wasn't rage. It was something far more powerful, and it left everyone speechless. Before we go any further, if you believe respect still matters in today's world, hit that like button and subscribe to Guard Royals. We're on the road to 1,000 subscribers, and with your help, we can reach it today. Your support helps us share real stories of dignity, discipline, and strength that the world needs to hear more than ever. Because this is one of them. This man didn't shout. He didn't strike back. But what he did, how he stood, what he said, will stay with you long after the video ends. And if you think it's just about a guy in a red uniform, think again. This is about character. And if you're with us on that, stay to the end. Because the moment he finally speaks might just change how you define strength. He didn't come for the history, he came for the attention. Kyle Jefferson, a 29-year-old American influencer with slick back hair, designer sneakers, and a selfie stick, strutted toward Buckingham Palace like it was his personal stage. Flanked by two friends and live streaming to over 30,000 viewers on TikTok, he smirked and declared, "Let's see if we can make this guard crack. Bet I get 1 million views by dinner." The royal guard he chose to target? Henry Walker, a decorated veteran who had served 2 tours in Iraq, now stood motionless at post, his expression unreadable, his will unshakable. But behind that stoic silence was a man who'd buried friends, survived ambushes, and carried pain in places most men couldn't pronounce. Kyle didn't see that. All he saw was a red uniform and an opportunity. He waved his hand inches from Henry's face. Nothing. He shouted, "Yo, robot, you blink or what?" Still nothing. Then he turned to his camera, laughing. "Reigns like a statue. What's he gonna do? File a complaint?" The crowd began to shift. A few young tourists chuckled nervously, but older visitors looked uncomfortable. A man in a Vietnam vet cap muttered, "Disgraceful." A mother pulled her child closer, whispering, "Don't watch him," elaborating to, but Kyle pushed further. He stepped closer than he should have. He crossed the invisible line, the line every soldier, every guard, every symbol of service is trained to protect. And when he did, something began to shift in Henry's posture. Something subtle, something serious. The crowd didn't realize it yet, but they were about to witness what happens when arrogance collides with honor. Kyle Jefferson wasn't done. He'd waved, he'd shouted, he'd mocked, but still, the royal guard refused to flinch. And that was the problem. Kyle turned back to his phone, walking in a small circle in front of the palace gate. "Still nothing, guys," he chuckled. "Man's made of stone. Let's see how far I can push it." He spun around theatrically and stepped in again, closer than ever, now just 12 inches from Henry Walker's face. The guard didn't move, not a blink, not a twitch. His expression remained fixed, but his eyes, they locked onto Kyle, locked onto the arrogance, locked onto the challenge. "Okay," Kyle grinned, "let's take this to the next level." The live stream chat exploded. "Do it. Make him move. Spit on him low." And Kyle listened. He looked the soldier square in the eyes, cocked his head, and with a smug smile, let fly a wad of spit. It hit Henry on the right boot, polished, precise, and ceremonial, the symbol of military discipline now defiled. Gasps echoed through the courtyard. A woman clutched her husband's arm. A child dropped her ice cream. A veteran in a wheelchair clenched his fists. Henry still didn't move. But something in his presence changed. It was the stillness of a coiled spring, not a passive wall, a controlled readiness, like a storm just below the surface. Kyle, emboldened by silence, stepped even closer. He lifted his right foot and gave Henry's boot a light kick. Not hard, just enough to test him. Oops, Kyle smirked. Guess I'm in royal trouble now, huh? The crowd didn't laugh this time. A man from Texas growled, "That boy's about to find out." Henry's fellow guards on the far perimeter took notice. One subtly adjusted his stance. The guard captain, posted near the archway, narrowed his eyes. Inside Henry's mind, time slowed. This wasn't just disrespect. It wasn't even about him anymore. It was about every soldier who'd ever worn the red. Every coffin he'd seen draped in a Union Jack. Every tear he'd held back as a mother received a folded flag. He remembered the heat of Basra. He remembered carrying his wounded brother through a hail of bullets. He remembered standing alone in a field of headstones, his wife's name etched in silence. And now, a man spat on that sacrifice, kicked it, not just once, but publicly, live, for likes. The air shifted. And then, a stomp, not a flinch, not a swing, a military stomp that thundered against the courtyard stone like a hammer of judgment. From the crack, the sound startled birds into flight. The crowd recoiled in shock. Even Kyle jumped back, eyes wide. Henry's voice rang out, not loud, but sharp and crystal clear. "Step back. You are interfering with royal military duty. This is your final warning." It wasn't just a line, it was a declaration. Suddenly, this was no longer a game. The Royal Guard wasn't a tourist prop. He was a man, a soldier, a symbol. And he had spoken. Giles staggered. "What? You can talk?" he half-laughed, half-terrified. The guard didn't reply. Instead, he returned to position, flawlessly. But his presence had changed. No longer background, now a force. The crowd, once filming, had lowered their phones. Even the chat had gone quiet. Somewhere near the back, a little girl whispered, "Is he going to be okay?" Her mother answered softly, "He'll learn something today." And perhaps for the first time, so would everyone watching. The echo of Henry's stomp still hung in the air. Al Jefferson had backed off, but his bravado had cracked. The crowd, now dead silent, watched as something rare unfolded. A royal guard had spoken, and now he was about to speak again. A commanding voice broke through from the far end of the courtyard. "Swordsman, stand down." It was Captain George Thorne. Stern, decorated, respected. He knew what had happened, and he knew it was time. Henry didn't hesitate. With practiced precision, he pivoted 45 degrees, boots clicking against the stone like a metronome of discipline. He stepped forward, not out of rage but with purpose. He marched to the center line, saluted the captain, and requested, in a voice calm and resolute, "Sir, permission to address the situation." Thorne gave a single nod. And just like that, the unthinkable happened. A royal guard, silent for hours, motionless in heat, mocked and spat upon, spoke to the world. He turned to face Kyle directly, but his words weren't for him. They were for everyone. 8 years ago, I was holding the hand of my brother while we waited for air support in the middle of a burning field outside Fallujah. He didn't make it. But before he slipped away, he said, "Promise me you'll stand for something." Henry's voice didn't shake. "I came home. I wore the uniform again. Different battlefield, same mission. You see this red coat and think it's a costume. I see the blood it represents." The crowd was frozen. No coughing, no shifting, even the wind seemed to pause. You think silence is weakness, that if someone doesn't fight back, they must be afraid. But standing still when every nerve in your body wants to react, that takes more strength than swinging a fist. He paused, his eyes scanned the crowd. There's a little girl here watching, and a war veteran in a wheelchair, and probably someone streaming this right now thinking, "He should have hit that guy. But if I had," this wouldn't be a moment of dignity. it would have just been another clip of chaos. We have enough of those already. Kyle's cocky grin had vanished. His phone hung by his side, the live stream still running but now flooded with comments like, "This man's a legend. That hit harder than a punch. I'm crying right now. I'm American. I'm ashamed." Henry stepped closer, but only one step. It wasn't a threat, it was a message. "You disrespected something you don't understand." He crossed a line, not against me, but against everyone who stood here before me. And for what? A video? A laugh? He tilted his chin slightly, eyes locked. "You don't owe me an apology. You owe yourself an understanding. Because one day you'll look back on this moment and realize this wasn't about going viral. This was about values." Another pause. Then he turned. Back to the crowd. Back to the palace. To those who served. To those who've lost. To those who still believe in dignity. This moment is for you. With one final movement, Henry returned to position. His spine straight, his jaw set. The sunlight caught the edge of his bayonet and cast a quiet gleam. And then, stillness. The kind that doesn't beg for attention but commands respect. No applause, no cheers, just reverent silence. Moment later, a little girl asked her father, "Is he a hero?" The man, choked with emotion, replied, "He's the kind of man we need more of." Behind the barricade, Kyle Jefferson stood completely still. His live stream was still on, but his ego had shut off. He slowly reached for the end broadcast button, but didn't press it. Because in that moment he knew the internet needed to hear every second. And so did the world. The silence lingered. For a few long, sacred seconds, no one moved. The tourist crowd that once giggled and snapped photos now stood as if attending a funeral. No one dared speak. Henry Walker had returned to stillness. But the world around him had started to shift. Kyle Jefferson, once confident, once invincible behind his screen, stood frozen. His phone still streamed, but the expression on his face was no longer smug. It was something closer to shame. Suddenly, from behind the gates, two Metropolitan Police officers approached, not running, just walking, with the calm, quiet confidence of authority. One nodded toward Kyle. "Sir, please step this way. You'll need to answer a few questions." Parker went haste to find Kremp. Kyle blinked, stuttered something, but he glanced back one last time at Henry, now motionless once more, as if none of it had ever happened. But it had, and thanks to the live stream, it was everywhere. Within minutes, the video clip exploded across platforms. It was screen-recorded, reposted, subtitled, translated, clipped into reels and tweeted by accounts from London to Los Angeles. One tweet simply said, "Spit on a soldier. What he got in return was discipline, honor, and a history lesson." Hashtags started trending. "Stand like Henry." "Royal dignity." "Respect the guard." "When silence speaks." Comment sections were flooded with emotion. As a U.S. Army vet, I cried. My grandpa would have stood and saluted this man. This should be shown in schools. This is what it means to be a man. Even news networks picked it up. Fox News ran it under "Royal Guard silences disrespect with power and grace." BBC World called it the moment that stopped a palace. Talk shows, podcasts, and YouTube reaction channels from every corner of the world reviewed the clip, pausing on that one step, that one stomp, that one line. "You don't owe me an apology. You owe yourself an understanding." But it wasn't just online. Across the Atlantic, in small towns and city suburbs, Americans were talking again. Over dinner tables in veterans' halls, at Sunday church groups. At a diner in Pittsburgh, a man in his late 70s folded his newspaper, wiped his eyes, and whispered, "If I haven't felt that much pride in a long time." In Kansas, a high school civics teacher paused her lesson to play the video. Her students, some of whom had never stood for a flag, stood in silence as the clip ended. And in Phoenix, Arizona, a group of elderly veterans gathered in the corner of a community center. They'd seen war, they'd buried friends, they'd seen too much. But when Henry Walker spoke, they all stood. No salute, just standing, out of respect. Kyle, meanwhile, became a symbol of the other side, the culture that mocks instead of listens, that performs instead of respects. He issued a public apology days later, shaky and clearly written by a PR firm. But no one forgot the live stream, because as one commenter put it, "You didn't just disrespect a man, you disrespected meaning." His brand deals vanished, his accounts were suspended, but more than that, he became the lesson. Back in London, Henry returned to his post the next day as if nothing happened. Pressed uniform, polished boots, same silence, but something had changed. A tourist from Ohio approached the rail with her grandson. She didn't speak loudly, didn't try to get attention. She just looked at him and whispered to the boy, "That's what dignity looks like." The boy nodded. He didn't take out his phone. He just watched. In the weeks that followed, Buckingham Palace saw a surge in respectful visitors. More veterans, more parents with their kids, a quiet transformation. People no longer just came for the changing of the guard. They came to see the place where a man stood his ground with grace. And maybe, just maybe, in a world that scrolls too fast, mocks too freely, and forgets too easily, one man in red standing still taught us all to pause, not with anger, not with force, but with something far more powerful, his character. The storm had passed. The internet moved on. The headlines slowed. The hashtags faded. But inside Henry Walker, something still stirred. The day after the incident, he stood again. Same uniform, same posture, same silence. But it wasn't the same man. That night, back at his modest flat outside London, Henry sat alone by a wooden desk. The kettle whistled behind him untouched. In front of him sat a small box, scratched, weathered, and tucked with care under the flag that had once draped over his brother's casket. He hadn't opened it in years. But tonight, he did. Inside were three things: a worn field journal from Iraq, a dog tag with his brother's name, Staff Sergeant James Walker, and a folded letter. The last letter from his wife, Claire, written before she passed unexpectedly during a heart condition flare-up, while Henry was still deployed. He unfolded it slowly, as if the paper might dissolve in his hands. The handwriting was smooth, gentle. "Dear Henry, if you're reading this, I didn't get to say goodbye the way I wanted to, but I hope I said it every day we were together. In the way I made coffee too strong, or kissed your forehead when you were too proud to ask for comfort." He exhaled. "You've always been stronger than you realize. But don't forget this: strength doesn't mean silence. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let people see you." He closed the letter, sat back, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to feel, not rage, not pain, relief, because for the first time since James died, since Claire passed, he had finally said something, and the world had listened. In the following weeks, Henry started changing his routine. Not drastically. He still woke up at 5 a.m., still pressed his uniform to sharp edges, still polished his boots until they reflected the sunrise. But now, once a week, he visited a youth outreach program in South London, one that helped troubled teens, many from military families. He didn't give speeches. He just sat, listened, and when asked, told stories about discipline, about loss, about standing tall without raising a fist. At first the kids didn't quite know what to make of him. A guy in red with a quiet stare. But over time, they leaned in. One boy, 16, asked him, "Did you ever want to fight back?" Henry paused, then replied, "Every part of me wanted to, but if I had," he would have gone viral, not the truth. Word of what he'd done spread, not through media anymore, but through people. Letters began arriving at the palace, handwritten, mostly from veterans, widows, teachers, and even prisoners. One came from a woman in Iowa. "My husband served in Vietnam. He never spoke about it, but he watched your clip and finally cried. Then he hugged me and said, 'That's what I wish I could have done. Thank you.'" Another came from a retired U.S. Marine. "You didn't just protect your post. You protected all of us, who know what it feels like to stand in silence while the world forgets." But through it all, Henry didn't seek praise. He didn't read every comment or chase interviews. He just kept standing, serving, living. Only now he was lighter. Something had been released that day. Not just pain, but permission. Permission to be more than a statue. To be human. To hurt and still hold the line. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the palace, Henry stepped off duty and walked past the familiar crowd. A man approached, mid-60s, weathered face, navy cap. He didn't say much, just offered a nod and said, "You said it better than any of us ever could." Henry nodded back, no words exchanged. But it was enough. In a world chasing noise, this man had redefined what strength looks like. And slowly people started listening, not to the loudest voices, but the still ones. The ones that don't shout but stand steady. And though the spotlight had faded, Henry Walker was never brighter. He never asked to be noticed. He never expected to go viral. He certainly didn't want to become a symbol. But when the world needed a reminder, Henry Walker stood still and became one. In a time when noise is currency and outrage often earns applause, something quietly powerful happened outside Buckingham Palace. A man was mocked, spat on, pushed, provoked. But instead of retaliating with fists or fury, he responded with something much rarer: composure. It wasn't passive, it wasn't weak. It was controlled, calculated, rooted in something deeper than anger. And that's what made it unforgettable. Because strength, true strength, doesn't always look like shouting. Sometimes it looks like standing tall with your boots planted and your values unshaken. Henry didn't plan his words. He wasn't reading a script. He just spoke from the place where soldiers speak when the bullets stop but the burden continues. He talked about his brother, about his wife, about sacrifice, about what the red coat truly means, not as a costume, but as a covenant, a promise to those who served, to those who fell, and to those still watching, wondering if anything sacred still exists in this world. And it turns out, people were watching, from Kansas to Kentucky, from Detroit to Dallas, from veterans in care homes to school teachers in small towns. People were talking about a guard who never raised his voice, yet managed to raise the standard. It sparked something. Men who hadn't spoken of their service in years started sharing. Teenagers who'd never thought about military service started researching. Families who usually scrolled through dinner sat in silence watching a clip again and again. It wasn't just a moment. It was a mirror, because we weren't just watching a soldier. We were watching ourselves, our values, our legacy, our decency, or the lack of it. And the message was clear. Dignity isn't outdated. Silence isn't weakness. Standing still when done with purpose can move nations. Henry never capitalized on the fame. He didn't launch a YouTube channel. He didn't sell merchandise. He didn't appear on morning shows. He simply stood again the next day, and the next, and the next. Because for him, the lesson wasn't about going viral. It was about reminding the world that some things still matter, even when the cameras turn off. If you stood in that courtyard, you might not remember the weather. You might not remember the name of the TikToker, but you'd remember the feeling. That hush. That moment when hundreds of strangers realized they weren't watching a tourist attraction. They were witnessing conviction. A man honoring his past, defending the sacred, representing thousands who no longer could. And maybe that's the lesson we all needed. In an age of instant reaction, sometimes the right response is no reaction at all. In a world full of performance, authenticity still cuts the deepest. And when tested, true character doesn't roar, it remains. So next time you see someone standing tall, silent, disciplined, don't mock them. Watch them, because they just might be carrying more than a uniform. They might be carrying a promise, a memory, a lesson you didn't know you needed. Thank you, Henry Walker. You didn't speak to be heard, but you were, and will remember. This moment moved you, like it did for millions. Leave a comment below. Tell us about someone in your life who showed strength through silence. Share this video with someone who believes dignity still matters. And don't forget to subscribe to Guard Royals. We're almost at 1,000 subscribers, and every one of you helps carry this message forward. Because in a world that scrolls fast, sometimes you need to stand still to truly move someone.